Okay, so now we're going to look at, among a few other things, the going back to the 1940s when the welfare state was introduced, and the idea of looking at the public services which were being provided in the UK and looking at how they could be reformed. And coming from the 1940s up to the present day, how things have changed, where policy may have taken a slightly different focus, but understanding some of the basic principles lying beneath what was being provided and perhaps why it was being provided as well. So, obviously, we all know that the welfare state was introduced in the 1940s, as I say, and we had the introduction of the NHS in, I think, 1947, 48, something like that. So the idea was that it would provide minimum levels of economic and social security for everybody, so nobody would be completely destitute, that there would be minimum services. And obviously the idea of providing things like health care, social housing, sickness, unemployment benefits. These were the main things that were provided under these idea of economic and social security. By providing health care, it would make sure that basic health issues were addressed. And as it says in the next bullet point, it was intended to eliminate mass unemployment and address large-scale poverty. I don't necessarily know how introducing healthcare, social housing, sickness and other benefits would eliminate mass unemployment, but I could understand it would be addressing poverty, but perhaps other economic policies which were designed to generate employment would also help deal with mass unemployment. And I suppose developing things like the NHS, taking things like that into public ownership would mean that some jobs may be created as a result of that. So, as you can see, spending in the welfare state is the largest item from the public purse by the 1970s, and I think the percentages are higher in Scotland than they are in England, but in Scotland there is still a lot of money and a lot of jobs tied up with the public sector. So public sector, there's still high spending in Scotland, and it still generates and provides a lot of employment opportunities and a lot of jobs as well. But as I'm sure you're all aware, in the 1980s onwards, transferring some of those services to the private sector, that could be done through things like nationalisation, not nationalisation, privatisation, so selling off public sector assets. But also more recently it would also be things like outsourcing or setting up arm's length organisations to run things like leisure facilities for the councils, social housing being provided by housing associations now rather than being run directly by the councils. So lots and lots of different things, and the next few slides are going to look at some of these individual aspects in more detail. We will be looking at social housing, we'll be looking at the health service, we'll be looking at education policy. So we're looking at some of these things more specifically and in a little bit more detail. Looking at the exam papers, there are questions on these individual policies, so you could get a question about housing policy, you could get a question about education policy. These things could come up individually in your exams. So you need to make sure that you've got a reasonable understanding of what's being discussed and meant by these different things. The last point here, when it talks about successive reforms continued with some services subject to co-payment, what co-payment means here is that some services may be means tested, that some services are free, and perhaps when these services were made available originally, they were totally free, but as time's gone on and there's been more demand for these services, it's more means tested, so it's not universal anymore. It's not something that's available to everybody. Some of it is means tested, and there are some things such as you go to the dentist, you'll get your free checkup, but if you require treatment, you have to pay the NHS charges for that treatment. So co-payment is where you're partly paying for the treatment that you're receiving. So that's what we're talking about here. So that takes us on nicely to look at the NHS more specifically. I think most people will be familiar with the expression of healthcare being free at the point of use, that we know that we can turn up to a hospital or we can go to our GP and we're not going to have to pay to see the doctor. We know that that service is free, and we're all paying for it through our national insurance contributions. Though it was set up to deliver healthcare universally to everybody, but it has been over time criticised at various points for not being efficient, not working effectively, and therefore it has been restructured, reorganised, become more accountable, become more professional. As it says, in the 1990s, you had service agreements being introduced, and primary care trusts were set up. PCTs are primary care trusts, for those of you that are not in the NHS. I can also remember the 1980s, 1990s, you had a sort of a professional management level being introduced, where it was managers who had been brought in and almost overriding what doctors were saying, or so it was much more in the hands of managers and accountants and things like that, and there was a lot of criticism that it was moving away from understanding what was happening from a clinical perspective. So you also had the introduction of regulatory bodies that are there to ensure cost-effective drugs. So you can't, a doctor can't just prescribe anything that they wish. There is an approved list, and they have to prescribe from that list. And there's controls over how they practice and what they do, and it talks here about regulatory bodies, but there's ethics committees and all these sorts of things as well, and I think most NHS trusts will have ethics committees as well, which will look at what the medical staff are doing and what the practices are doing within, what practices are taking place within the NHS. Okay, so that is a very, very quick overview of the NHS, and it's something that, the government keeps saying that they want to continue to invest in it. We want to continue with making sure it's available to everybody, and it is a very emotive subject. It's something that people care passionately about, and it may be worth your while investigating what the current government policy is on the NHS. Okay, so moving on. Income maintenance. This is about benefits, basically. And again, different governments at different periods in time will have had their own policy agenda of what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve. It will depend on the economic situation in the country at the time. So basically a lot of the economic stuff will depend on not just what whether it's Labour and they want to spend money, or whether it's Conservatives and we have this general idea of they're out to save money and benefit the rich. But putting all of that aside, they will have to look at what kind of state the country's in. Are we in a recession? Do we have a lot of growth and prosperity? All of these things will shape the kind of decisions that they're making about their provision of welfare benefits. So, going back to the 1940s, the legislation at the time, they introduced state pensions, they introduced unemployment benefit, other financial benefits, family allowance for children. All of these things are fairly new. They weren't introduced until the 1940s. But come the 1990s, after 1997, when New Labour came to power, they were concerned that we had people in society who were dependent on benefits, and we had situations, or we do still have situations, where children are growing up in homes where they see their parents on benefits and they don't know any different, and they grow up thinking that's the norm. And I'm sure we've all spoken to people where it's actually more cost effective for the people to stay on benefits because they would lose so much if they actually went out and got a job. So New Labour had this idea of introducing working tax credits and things like that, where they're trying to reward people for being in employment, but recognising that sometimes their wages are too low for them to survive, to live. So they'll top up those, and they had a welfare to work strategy where they were providing support to get people back into employment, and they developed a lot of policies and a lot of strategies around about how to do that. Training opportunities, development opportunities, and if people didn't take up these opportunities, their benefits might be withdrawn or might be cut. So, trying to encourage people into back into employment, and that's where the minimum income guarantee for families comes into. And tax benefit, child tax, I believe, was taxed first in the 1970s, I think. But certainly child benefit, when it was first introduced, was tax-free, but you now it does count towards your taxable income as well. So what we have here is kind of what was happening in the 1990s, but moving up to the current day, we know that this is all changing, and we have universal credit, which has obviously fairly recently been introduced the past few years, but it's quite controversial. There's been issues about whether or not it works. It's actually disadvantaging people. And another aspect might be the benefits that are provided to people with disabilities, and some of the assessments that they're having to go through, looking at all of that they're being declared fit for work when they're not always fit, and their assessment systems don't seem to be working particularly well either. So government policy does change. So you need to be aware of what some of the current policies are, and I think if we do end up with something looking at income maintenance, you could end up talking about universal credits and things like that. So it may be worthwhile just even having a basic understanding of some of these things, so that if the question were to come up in your exam, you at least have a basic understanding and able to answer some questions. Right, so moving on from benefits to looking at social housing. So this is council houses, basically, or what were council houses. I know that nowadays most councils have moved their housing stock over to housing associations that run them on their behalf. So, again, Labour government after the Second World War introduced a system of housing subsidies, so giving the local councils money to provide supported housing to people who couldn't afford to own their own homes, basically. But it was means tested, so we're looking at how big their family is, what their income is, what kind of job they are, and they'd be put on a housing list and they'd work their way up the list till they get the house, I suppose. That's how these things usually work. So again, the idea of council houses is fairly new, but coming right up to date, as I say, the council stock across most of the UK, I believe it's slightly different in England and in Scotland, but the general idea is still the same. Council housing stock has primarily been transferred across to housing associations who manage those properties as a social enterprise. I think most housing associations are probably registered as charities, so they're in the voluntary sector rather than the public sector. Conservative Party in power in the 1980s introduced Right to Buy, so people could actually buy their council houses, and when it was first introduced it was highly discounted, so people were getting council houses for a very good price. That would be the incentives, but after Labour came into power in the 1997, they still supported this and they continued to encourage private ownership of property. Although the schemes as they were in the 1980s have been updated and amended and changed. As you would imagine, they introduced something, they decide that it's not quite working the way they wanted to, or people are getting houses too cheaply and therefore it's not generating as much income as they had hoped. But it also created problems in as much as if you sell off all your housing stock, you don't have social housing available for people who are in need. And therefore we then also at one point saw a rush of demand for council housing, that the councils didn't necessarily have enough money to actually be able to build new housing stock. I think, I may be wrong, but I think the current situation is that they can still sell some of their council housing stock or some of the social housing stock, but I think certain percentage of it has to be retained so that they are still able to provide, meet the needs of society. What else can I say? I think one of the other things that's a fairly new introduction as well, and it kind of fits in with some of the other stuff I've talked about in previous presentations about how government wants to regulate what's going on rather than actually taking things back into public ownership. As there was less social housing available, more and more private landlords were setting up and people were going to private landlords. But when you've got a totally free open market, it can be abused. And there were some unscrupulous landlords who were not looking after property very well, not maintaining the properties. So regulations were introduced and controlled much more closely the conditions that landlords had to operate within, how they had to maintain the properties, the standards that they had to comply with. So not taking the housing back into public hands, but allowing it to stay within the private sector, but having much more regulation covering that at the same time. Okay, so From there, moving on to the education and training policy, and quite a lot of information here, and I've got an awful lot more written down in my notes, but the key thing here to think about is, a bit like everything else, the idea of compulsory education, having everybody in education up to, I think originally it was 15, and then I think in the 1970s, I think by 1972, it was increased, the compulsory school leaving age was increased from 15 to 16. But in 1944, the Education Act was introduced, which is the act which introduced the compulsory education for primary and secondary education. Successive policy for government has always been about introducing an education policy to have a more educated working population who were going to be more economically active. So they're working, they're contributing to society, they're paying taxes. So they're helping the economy to grow, they're helping it to be more profitable, and bringing it up from the 1940s right up to the 1990s. The focus is on the fact that we have a skills gap in the UK, that our workforce is, as a country, our workforce is less skilled than other parts of Europe, and therefore we want to plug that gap. Our lack of skills as a nation is holding us back, and therefore if we develop a strong education policy, provide training, encourage all of this, then we will improve our productivity within the country, and we will be more competitive. So education and training, developing skills, having a better educated, more highly skilled workforce, working age population in the UK means that we are more productive, more competitive. We have a growing economy, so everything comes back to economics all the time. So as I say, the slide says, whoops, how do I get it to go back? There we go. So from the 1940s, our education policies aimed at enhancing social and occupational mobility. We talk about, I know there's a lot of talk just now about whether the next generation will be better off than their parents. And there always was this. I mean, I can remember when I was younger, you were always aspiring to be better than your parents. The next generation should be more affluent, should be more successful, should be rising up the social ladder. That's declining now. That's not happening as much as it did previously. But obviously introducing education, training was all designed to try and encourage that. Various government policies will always focus on how to ensure that the quality of education and the quality of training is to a standard that is going to achieve the objectives set out from the policy. So we saw things like the national curriculum being introduced, Curriculum for Excellence in Scotland, and introducing performance tables, league tables, setting schools against each other. We see league tables published for universities, and you can see who's at top or whatever. Going back to the 1970s even, colleges were really just providing night classes, courses for people who are already in employment and coming to college one day a week doing day release. And it wasn't really until the 1980s that it was recognised. I think at that point you probably only had about 5% of the population going to university, but recognising that post-compulsory education could be quite important, and was another way of improving skills within the workforce. So colleges started to become much more active, offering many more courses, and the focus became much more on developing knowledge, skills within these people so that they're increasing their employability and their flexibility within the workplace. And there would be competition between schools, between colleges, to drive improved performance and efficiency. So by having these league tables across all like school education, college education, higher education, as well as further education, you're driving improved performance and efficiency, and have become more up to date with the introduction of tuition fees. People going to university nowadays don't get grants like they used to do in the 1990s, 1980s. You don't get grants, you've got to take out a student loan. You're having to, if not in Scotland but in other parts of the UK, you have to pay tuition fees. If you're having to pay these tuition fees, and if you're having to take out loans because you don't get grants anymore, you're having to invest a lot, and you're taking on a lot of debt to go to university, to study. So therefore, the students are beginning to be seen as customers who are buying services, and therefore perhaps there's more accountability from the universities in terms of the level of service they're providing, the quality of teaching they're providing as well. So perhaps that's taken it back a bit to the market forces, that the customer, the students, are driving the quality of education that's being provided to them as well. So there's more accountability. It's not something I can evidence, it's my opinion, but it is something to perhaps think about, that again, things are changing and tuition fees are not always particularly popular. It is one area that might impact on Scotland in terms of Brexit, because at the moment, although we don't charge tuition fees to Scottish students or European students, because English students going to an English centre would have to pay fees, we can charge them fees coming to Scotland. It will be interesting to see, and the reason we're doing that is actually because of European legislation, because they're part of the EU, because they're part of Britain and not a European country. They don't have the same rights to free education, the same as someone from France or Germany would have coming to the UK, coming to study in Scotland. So it's interesting to see whether that would make Scottish centres less attractive if we lose out to Europe, because perhaps if we leave Europe, if Brexit happens, the possibility is that European students coming to study in Scotland would have to pay tuition fees the same as they do in other countries, the same as they would have to do going to England. So if they're having to pay the same, might they choose to go down south rather than coming to Scotland? So, there are things that education policy can have quite an influence on things as well. And you don't think Brexit's going to impact on something like this, but as I've just illustrated, it can do. So again, quite a bit to think about. Education policy seems to come up quite a bit in the exams, and it is something we'll be looking at in class next week anyway, but I would certainly suggest that you have a think about education policy and make sure that you're aware of it prior to going into the exam.